¿Qué hay, gente de Fundiendo con la Biblia? Bienvenidos a otra entrega de nuestro podcast que en algún punto se llamará Fluyendo con la Biblia. Y como ustedes saben, de vez en cuando tenemos invitados que son académicos o gente que está en el campo de Biblia o de traducción, ya sea enseñando, o sea en la parte práctica activa. Y hoy tenemos un invitado súper especial que es, de hecho, compañero de trabajo, es Jost Zetzsche, quien estará hablando con nosotros sobre lo que hace en Tips. Así que, bienvenidos. Jost, welcome to Fundiendo con la Biblia. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate this.
Where are you based?
I'm based on I live in Oregon, right on the coast. So I actually live close to the most beautiful beach in the world. I think it's the most beautiful beach in the world. It's not really
Okay.
warm, but it's wild and beautiful.
Yeah, well, I think that the Dominican, the Republic beaches will
Will
beat
not
you,
agree. I know. I
but
know.
it's fine. But you got a point. You live really close to the beach, which is
And I think
is
it's good
great.
to think that where you live is the most beautiful place in the world, right? I mean, isn't that
Yes.
isn't that what we all should think? Yeah.
Yeah. Right on. And Jost, something that I realized when I invited you is that I've known you for several years, but I've never asked you how did you get into Bible translation or into the biblical stories world?
Well, I grew up in Germany and grew up in a nominally Christian environment, but not a Christian environment really. I was Lutheran, got confirmed, but really had nothing to do with faith much. And then I lived in China for a few years and became a Christian in China. And not surprisingly, became really interested in Chinese Bible translation. And then after I returned home to Germany, I pursued research on Chinese Bible translation. So I wrote a history of Chinese Bible translation. And the original plan was to then, after I finished my PhD, to go out and maybe do Bible translation in some way or the other myself. But I was then diagnosed with MS, multiple
Oh,
sclerosis, which made it really hard at that point to do that. So I completely strayed from Bible translation for 20, 25 years. I was a technical translator from English into German. And about 10 years ago, I was walking on that beautiful beach that I mentioned and had this sort of almost like a vision, not a vision, but kind of, I thought to myself, there's 3,500 languages the Bible has been translated into. And um, which is wonderful, and it's a number that's ever growing. But really, we, the church, the overall church, really doesn't have a way to look into those Bible translations. Now, the Bible translations in all these languages were, of course, primarily done for the people who speak that language. But wouldn't it be amazing if the larger church could understand how uniquely these people communicate with God through Bible translations? And, having been a translator for all these years and having done research into Chinese Bible translations, me understand that languages are unique. They are unique. Every language is different from any other language and has unique ways of expressing reality and has unique ways of expressing God and what God means in our lives. And if you think about it, this is a real opportunity to learn more about the Bible and God if you are able to see how uniquely these languages express that reality, that spiritual reality. And so I was really impressed with that idea kind of and try to then find somebody an organization who would sponsor that, and did eventually find UBS. And UBS has been just about the perfect home for that, for a number of reasons. One is that UBS is interconfessional, so I don't just focus on, on Protestant translations. I focus on, Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox translations, which has been really amazing for me personally, but also for the project. And what UBS has done is it's given me a team of programmers, and it's given me a board, which is made out of UBS translation consultants, but also SIL consultants, and from Pioneer Bible translators and Lutheran Bible translators and Seed. So it's a very widely spread board that helps me in my work to build this tool that we're going to talk about. And so that's my my path to Bible translations, but not a very straight path, but it worked nevertheless. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Yes. How did you end up in China?
I studied Chinese. I went to university in Germany to study Chinese, and part of the idea of studying Chinese is that you will spend some time in China. And I spent a little bit longer time in China than was planned, but yeah, I really I felt very home in China, and often miss China, I have to say. I met my wife in China. She's not Chinese; she's Caucasian. Yeah.
That's great. So that tool that you talk about is tips. What is tips?
TIPS is an acronym for Translation Insights and Perspectives. And TIPS is essentially a really large database, freely available to anyone who wants to access it at tips.translation.bible. And it's a curated collection of translations of biblical concepts or words, or sometimes whole verses, into right now about 1,000 some languages, that I feel as a curator sheds an additional light on a biblical key term, a biblical concept, or whatever. And the way we are doing that is by essentially translating or back translating, if you will, from whatever language this might be into English, and explaining the story with as much data as we have, why they chose this translation versus any other translation. And the idea kind of is we sometimes talk about a prism. So a prism is a tool, as you of course know, that breaks white light into all the different colors of the spectral colors. And I feel that TIPS is a little bit like it. So we have, the white light being, God's word or something. And the full expression of God's word, while the original texts are Hebrew and Greek and Aramaic and whatever, the expression, the full expression finds itself, of course, not in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic, but in languages that we speak and read today, right? And so what TIPS essentially is sort of it's like something that breaks apart into very detailed ways what the biblical text says in languages that we can't otherwise access.
Yeah, you talk about key terms, biblical key terms, and that could mean different things to different people. In the world of Bible translation, what is a key term? I think that's important for the rest of our conversation, for our audience especially.
Well, go ahead and you describe what you think is a key term as a Bible consultant. You are much more qualified in that than I am, really.
Yeah, you think?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, for our audience, biblical key terms are terms that could be difficult to translate in some ways, and that, or they don't translate in a really good way in different places. So what we try to do in Bible translation is to make what do you say, that a database in each translation of the key terms for that specific translation. That's
right.
what is
And often those
for
are
me.
terms that have an impact not just on one little section, but an impact on, on maybe not every book in the Bible, but in many different, those terms appear usually in many different places in the Bible. And we hope sort of for consistency in the way we use those terms, right?
Yes. And those key terms could be theological, like
Right.
justification, righteousness, holiness, and so on, or they could be dogmatic in some ways. Like the difference between theological and dogmatic is that theological are terms that are important for definitions, the actual definitions of doctrinal based words, and dogmatic are terms that maybe are important for some people because of their religion background, but not important for other
Right.
people.
Yeah.
So theological terms are broader in some ways. The what I call dogmatic terms are more punctual, I will say, in some ways. Do
Let
you
me
see
give
it
you,
like
can I
that,
give
or?
you, yeah, it's great.
Okay.
Can I give you a couple of examples of key
Okay.
terms that I found information about? So what I think your audience and what you need to understand is that there is those 3,500 languages the Bible has been translated into, right? So amazingly much material. But as long as somebody doesn't help me to understand what I'm looking at when I go into YouVersion or into DBL or other places where I find those translated Bibles, they're as meaningless to me as to anyone, because of course I don't read all those languages, right? So here are a number of stories or a number of insights of the translation of key terms where I was lucky enough to find people who helped me understand them. So one, for instance, is in Hakka Chinese. Hakka Chinese is a form of Chinese that is spoken both in Taiwan and in parts of China. The term for the love that God has, often in New Testament context, it's the agape sort of idea, but not necessarily only that. The term that God has for the love that God has for people is translated with a word. I don't speak Hakka. Tungxiak in Hakka, it's Tungxi in Chinese. And what that means, if you translate it directly, it means pain love. And pain love is so interesting because the word compassion, which comes from the Latin, compassio, with suffering, is exactly that. And I think this is one of those examples where you have a language that you might have heard about. I mean, it's a fairly large language, but Hakka Chinese is not really on the minds of people typically. But you have this language that came up with this translation of that word, within their culture, that makes us understand that maybe just a little bit better. So you imagine John 3:16, right? When it talks about God's love, that he gave his only begotten son. That's painful. Right?
Yeah.
It's a painful love that he has, that he gives his son to die for us. And I think that's one example that is just really, really powerful. Or here's another example. Also love, right? And also the love that God has for his people, for human beings. And this is from a language called Hindi. And Hindi is spoken in Cameroon, and this translation is actually still ongoing. But the story that was shared with me is 10 or 15 years ago. So this translation has been going for a long time. And the story is about the way that love is expressed. So the way that love is expressed in Hindi is either by the words, I have to look it up here, dvi or dva. Dvi means when I dvi somebody, I express that I was madly in love with that person at some point, but then sort of lost that love.
Mm.
Dva means that I love that person because he or she is doing all the right things. It's
Wow.
based on merits, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another word that was possible to form, but it just was never formed because the imagination of dvu, which means loving somebody no matter what, no matter how much that person messes up. That was just not feasible to imagine for
Mm-hmm.
the speakers until Bible translation was done, and that was the word that was chosen for God's love for people, which is independent of what people do, that He loves us anyway. And the discovery of that term was so radical for
Mm.
the community to encounter that they had mass conversions. I mean, they were
Wow.
gobsmacked by that concept that there is a kind of love that they had never imagined it to a degree that they actually never even used that word, even though they knew it was theoretically possible.
Wow.
Kind of a powerful example. Or here's another, and this is not just for the love that God has. This is for everybody's love. In Mairasi, is a language spoken in Papua New Guinea. Love is translated as desiring one's other faces.
Wow.
So if you desire somebody else's face, that's what love is. And what I really like about that is that love is not a theoretical concept. Love is real. Love is wanting to be with that person. I don't say I love my neighbor in a theoretical kind of way. In my Rasi, you say, I love my neighbor because I want to see him. I want to see
Mm-hmm.
her. I want to be in his or her face in a
Wow.
positive sense. Also powerful, right?
Yeah.
So I think those are really good examples of what tips is about. Collecting data to make us, as English readers in our case, understand what these very important biblical concepts are actually about. And in a way that we can't maybe get to with our own language, because every language, we'll talk about that maybe later on,
Mm-hmm.
every language is limited in a certain way, right?
Yeah.
But if you have ways to look at that prism that breaks it apart into all these different colors, into all these different, minute differences that taken together are very powerful and change the way you understand those concepts. That's really powerful.
Yeah. And it's as you're talking right now, I'm thinking on how helpful tips is for people that don't understand the complexity of language. Usually people don't understand Bible translation because they don't understand the complexity of language, or the limitations that languages could have. I remember working with that was my first assignment in Bible translation. It was a group in Venezuela, Wotija, and they don't have any word for positive emotions
Mm.
or positive uh, sentiments. I don't know if you use that word in English. So in their language, to say that you love someone is that I like, if I say I love my wife, it's like I hate everybody but my wife.
Oh, wow.
So it was really
Wow.
complex to get to the point to define love in God terms, because you couldn't say that God, hate everybody but
Wow.
uh but and actually when people are saying or simplifying the way translation work, I usually remember those cases, and the cases like the cases you're mentioning right now.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, so it's going to be your job to send me more information about that story and the name of the language and all that, so I can
Okay.
enter into tips after this interview.
Okay. Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
what
I have a lot of stories, because we have
oh,
problems with
please,
forgiveness,
oh,
love.
forgiveness.
Yes.
Forgiveness are such, we have so many stories about forgiveness, which just like love is so essential for Christians to
Mm-hmm.
understand, right? And if you look at the English term forgiveness, that really is not a particularly meaningful term. Of course, the concept is meaningful,
Mm-hmm.
but the term is kind of empty for us, right? Forgiveness. We don't really know what that means. there's this one story, and there's many good stories about
Mm-hmm.
forgiveness that we have in the tool, but one that I particularly like is from a language, and I have to look it up here. It's called Mbaga, and it's spoken in Congo, in both Congos, in the Democratic Republic and the other Congo. And they first used the term when they talked about forgiveness in the Bible, that's pronounced ele. And ele means forgive and forget. It means,
Okay.
you forgive, and once you forgive, you've forgotten it. They kept on translating the New Testament, and they realized we can't use that. We can use it for God, all right, because God promises us that if He forgives us, He forgets. That's biblical. That we know
Mm-hmm.
that we are assured of that. But we know ourselves. We can't do that. We are realistic enough about our own limitations that we can forgive something. Do we truly forget it? Most people don't. So they ended up actually then having to come up with a separate term for forgiveness for people, because they know of the weakness of people, or they know the fallibility of people. And they then found a term that they can use for forgiveness when it relates to people, called mboko, which means to excuse something or to excuse
Okay.
someone. Not nearly as powerful as a term that they use for God, but because people are not as powerful as God.
Yeah.
I love that also. It's sort of a negative story in a sense, but it's a super realistic story about um, you know about uh, about how we should carefully choose our terms to not frustrate users or readers of the Bible, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you would continue to use a term that is essentially not achievable, that describes something that is not achievable for Bible readers, that's also unfortunate.
Yeah. There's so many interesting cases. How do you decide what or which insights are included in the database? Because
That's a really great question. And so I mentioned before that I have this board or this group of people, it's like 9 or 10 people, and all very, very experienced and all of them, I think, actually, Fausto.
okay.
Um, and what this board does for me is they give me guidance on what I should do, in larger terms, but also in specific cases where I'm not sure whether something should be included or not, for instance, right? So, for instance, I don't want to include anything that would embarrass somebody.
Okay.
Maybe embarrass politically, maybe embarrass or endanger a situation where maybe there is not Bible translation is not permitted by the authorities, or where a careless reader might misunderstand something and might interpret something to be not theologically correct,
Mm-hmm.
because the tool, what tips really is, it's a tool for Bible translators to use in their translation work, but it's also for the general church, and that's really my personal main interest. It's for pastors to prepare sermons, it's for parishioners to prepare Bible studies, and for people to look up stuff that the pastor mentioned in the sermon and wanting to compare it to what they find in tips, etc. But these
Mm-hmm.
people are not linguistically trained, right? And sometimes things that are maybe very easily understandable for somebody who is linguistically trained might not be so for somebody who's not, that
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have that. So what my board does is when I encounter those situations, I have a really good sounding board and a forum to discuss that with them, and for them to say yay or nay, essentially, and I follow that direction. So that's a long answer to your question. I try to add everything that I feel sheds an additional light on something that cannot be easily found in major languages,
Okay.
that cannot be easily found in English, French, Spanish, German, Chinese or whatever. But with the restrictions that I mentioned just now, if it's something that can have a negative impact, I just don't use it. I just don't add it.
Yeah, you're a curator in some curator. How do you
I'm a
call it?
curator. That's exactly what I'm doing.
Yeah,
I'm just a,
and I think that now with the growing, I would say, about the overwhelming number of data in the
Mhm.
internet, we need more
Oh yeah,
curators.
absolutely.
Like I was thinking, like about that on theological web pages or theological social media accounts where you know there's thousands of people sharing their knowledge or their not
Right,
knowledge,
right,
and we need more curators right now in this at this time, specifically at this time.
right. You're absolutely right. And I'm fortunate enough to have some academic background. So I'm very familiar with quoting stuff correctly, with citing stuff correctly, with giving sources, etc. And I have maybe some of your users go to the tool and go like, that's not very useful. But what I can promise them is that it's honest. So any data that you find in there is real. I've
Mhm.
never made up any data. I've never come up with something that sounds good but is maybe not completely true. So
Yeah,
every piece
that's your work as a curator
that's my work.
to
Exactly. That's what I'm that's
expound
my
what
job.
is real, what is positive, what is
Yeah.
in some ways
Mhm.
useful. And that led me to the next question. How do you collaborate with translators or translation teams on the ground? Uh,
I'm a beggar.
to Okay.
Really, that's what I am. That's what I'm sort of only halfway joking. I spent much of my time begging for data.
Okay.
Reaching out to people that I, have already met or have not met yet, asking them to send me data. Because it's not that I don't have much data still that I could enter. I could probably not get any new data. I still would have enough data for the next couple of years to enter, but still I want to, get as much data as I possibly can at any point. And so I'm pleading with them to either, give me a few minutes every once in a while to send me some interesting stories, or I also sometimes actually hire people to do some work for me. So, for instance, we have if your users or if your listeners go to the
Mhm.
tool, they'll find that there's a lot of sign language translation data in there. And the way that we enter sign language translation is, of course, per video, right? I mean, that's how the translation happens. But if there would only be the videos, that would be useless. There needs to be an English translation of the video, right?
Mhm.
So we have lots of Mexican Sign Language, Russian Sign Language, or all kinds of lots of Brazilian Sign Language, Libras, but it's always back translated into English. Now I can't do that. I don't understand. I'm not a signer, and so I'm sometimes paying people to actually translate that back into English for me. I'm right now negotiating with a Jamaican sign language team to do that. They're working on a translation of Ephesians, and I'm very excited to get that
Okay.
Jamaican Sign Language translation of Ephesians, but only if I can show my users what it actually means. Just to see some signs, that's not really helpful. It's really helpful to see the signs and then understand how different sign language translation, sign language translators translate the Bible from written translation. Yeah, I spent probably a third of my day writing emails and responding to emails, negotiating, and a lot of fun, I think, but a lot
Mhm.
of asking people for favors or things like that. But I meet amazing people in the process, so that's really good.
What have you learned in the process? I maybe it's a broader, it's a question with a lot of answers.
Yeah, it is.
But briefly, have what have you learned in the process of collecting data from languages?
Well, I've learned a lot, I think, about the nature of language, maybe, and the how our image of God as expressed in the Bible is related to language. Language clearly is very powerful, right? That's one of our major modes of communication. There's other modes also, we express ourselves in a number of ways, but language is really crucial to how we communicate, whether it's sign language or spoken language or other forms of language. As powerful as it is, as fickle it is also. Its language is very powerful and very weak at the same time, because what it can do really well is it can express the reality around us quite well. We're equipped to do that. So we can express the truth of physical and biological realities very well by saying there is gravity, and gravity always happens. When I hold the pen and I open my hand, the pen will fall down because there is gravity. That's something you can express very easily in any language, and there will not be really interesting stories about those translations because they're just kind of straightforward, right? But there's, of course, another reality also, the reality of faith, which is sort of a reality beyond reality, sort of, a reality that we can't see, we can't taste, we can't feel, we can't, listen to. And and it's that reality where language becomes, less expressive sometimes, or becomes very expressive, but has to express in ways that doesn't actually describe what it's experiencing, because there is no such experience, not comparable to the one that I have when I talk about gravity. And what I found is that the more approaches to a text you have and you encounter that talks about that kind of reality, the clearer the text becomes to you. And that's sort of what we're trying to do, by looking at not one, but at 1,000 languages, or eventually 3,500 languages, how that is being expressed. And we know that it's not going to be a full expression even then. We know that, in 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about that dark mirror, right? That the reality of God is like that of looking into a dark or a cloudy or a milky mirror, and that we believe that is true, right? So we don't see God quite as clearly as we want to, despite the fact that we have language, but we can get ever closer, I think, and we sort of hope to help on that way to get ever closer, and that's that was the idea. But by working on it for the last 10 years or years now, that idea has become a real deep conviction that language can come close to something supernatural, if you will, but never quite get there.
Yeah. How many languages do you have in tips right now? Translation languages.
I think it's like 1,050 or something like that.
Okay, it's a lot.
And sometimes it's a lot. Yeah. Sometimes I only have like one little story from a language. Sometimes I have hundreds or even thousands of stories from a language. So tips is really massive right now. So we have 80,000, almost 80,000 individual entries. And these entries can be, if you would print them out, there can be pages and pages and pages. So an entry is not just a little blurb, it's often very, very large. We have 80,000 of those. We have data on literally every verse in the Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant Old and New Testaments, except the Ethiopian Orthodox books, that they have 6 or 7 books that are not used by the other churches, and we have just started to add them, and we don't have data for every single verse yet, but we're working on that. And so it's really, really large, and yet we know it's just kind of drop in the bucket so far, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and that's so exciting that
Yeah.
we have worked really hard to get to that point, that to the point that we're at, but we know there is a lot to go still.
Yeah. Have you seen tips used in real life Bible translation projects? Like
Yeah, well,
you have
I mean,
testimonial
I
of
get,
people that have say, "Hey, I'm using tips in my translation
mhm.
projects in this way." Can you share
Yeah, quite
something?
often. So, you know, it's been actually very surprising. You know, I sort of go by, you know, my gut feeling, plus I'm getting some direction from my board, but I often enter data that I don't really know whether it's useful or not. And fairly early in the project, um, I decided, or we decided, to enter back translations of complete verses into the tool. As you, of
Okay.
course, know, the back translation process is really important in the Bible translation process for consultants to come in that don't often speak that typically don't speak the language that is being worked on, for them to check the translation, right? That's what your work
Mm-hmm.
consists of to a great degree. And often these back translations are not publishable. They are often very crude, sort of. You know,
Pretty rough.
they're rough, right? And rough in a way that I would never publish them. But there are a number of back translations that are not so rough. For whatever reason, the team decided to make this into into a really very readable translation, or they even did things like front translations where they specifically created back translation that they wanted to use as examples for a group of languages.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've entered a number of them. So I have about 5 or 6 different um, languages per verse that I've entered for every verse in the Old New Testament. And I'm telling all of this because this is, to my great surprise, the resource that Bible translators like the best.
Oh, wow.
So Bible translators, I've gotten so many emails by Bible translators who say, "This is what I use all the time. This is where I go when I you know, either translate or help a team as a translation consultant to get ideas how you can approach a particular verse." So that was a big surprise to me, but I'm very happy about it because that's a resource that we have that is quite well developed within our tool. We don't have that for the deuterocanonical books, but for the Protestant Old and New Testament, we have that for every single verse, and so that was interesting. Um, for church users, and that was also a surprise, they found that the UBS handbooks are incredibly valuable to them. So
Hmm.
the UBS handbooks, for those listeners of you that don't know what they are, UBS throughout the last 60 or so years have published translation commentaries essentially on all the books of the Bible. That you know, they started in the early 60s, and the early 60s ones are not very good. They're very uh, well, they're good, but they're not
They don't have as much information about
that's right.
language that people need.
You know better than I. But the ones that are, especially the ones that are published after 2000, are amazingly good sometimes.
Hmm.
And so what we've done is we imported them all. So every verse in the Bible has the whole UBS translation commentary with it, and the general church user loves that because it's a they because these commentaries turn out to be kind of deeper commentary than any other commentary because they're made for translators. Translators need to look deeply into a text. Translators need to be made aware of problems the text could have. Translators need to be offered several alternatives how they can approach the text, and that is something that's not easily available in other commentaries that are also available
Mm-hmm.
online. But so I'm the we have like a comment feature in tips, and 2 out of 3 comments are about the commentaries and express great thankfulness for those. And those are regular users, not translation consultants. So also a big surprise, but that's what it is.
Wow, it's great. 2 more questions.
Yeah.
One, what are your hopes for the future development of tips, especially in terms of technology or accessibility? You have talked about the regular Joe, the lay person that is not working Bible translation and probably is looking for information in tips. What are your hopes for the expert, says, for the target audience of tips, and then for people that need this information to grow as in their faith or academically?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one hope is, well, what we do have is we do have an API. API stands for Application Programming Interface. So that means that we can talk to other websites and other tools.
Okay.
We can allow other tools and other websites to pull content out of tips and display it in their own environment. That's something that right now we're doing with many different Bible societies, that we are helping them to implement tips on their website as a tool for their users. So that's one thing that we are looking at distributing our data. What I would also like to have is eventually is an app that would maybe not restrict, but help non-linguistically educated users to get to data more easily and make it that they feel is more accessible. So that's something that is not going to happen overnight, but we're thinking about that. We also are really pushing to have tips be available not just on a website and not just on Bible societies websites, but also in tools like maybe like YouVersion, or we have a good connection with Bible Gateway, and all tools like that are already there and have a large group of users. And we think that our content is certainly valuable enough to be a good resource for those users also. And then also on a content level, I mentioned that we have started to import some of the books from the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. We're still missing 3 of those books. So, and the reason why we're missing them is because we don't have an English. There is no English translation for those books, and we would love to find an English translation, or maybe even sponsor an English translation or something to have a tool that has the complete canon of the Christian church. To my knowledge, there is no such a tool that is readily available to lay users. That has books like Enoch and Jubilees and books that you might have heard of but really don't know how to access. In our tool, you have all these books right next to books like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Books that we use day in and day out. So my dream is that we have all of those books covered. My dream, of course, also is that we have as many languages covered as we can. And we've had quite a bit of interest from universities. I've spoken to a number of colleges that are also really interested in using their data for their theology departments or wherever they want to use them. So lots of plans, lots of dreams.
I've been thinking to languages, some of those I work with, that they're doing Bible translation, but they don't have any information of data about the languages, especially oral languages.
Yeah.
Do you think TIP could be a good tool to do field linguistics?
Absolutely. So
on those languages with the Bible translation information that we could have?
I think so. I mean, I haven't spoken about the really embarrassing thing that is associated with tips, and that is that it's English right now. The data. So it's kind of crazy. We talk about more than 1,000 languages in the tool, but we do that in English. We don't do it in any other language. And I'm super painfully aware of that limitation. Of course, it's a huge limitation, right? Because it cuts out so many people. So, and I should have mentioned it earlier, but one goal that we have is find ways to make it accessible in other languages also, which then would
That would be fantastic.
help. Would be fantastic. We are, constantly trying out machine translation, how far, with large language models and AI, how far they can go, and they don't go quite far enough yet. They don't go far enough because what we are talking about in tips often is the nuances sort of language, and machine translation doesn't do well with nuances, not well enough for our purposes anyway. But we hope at some point that we can, present. It's impossible to translate the data manually. It's too much data. It's just too much. It's unreasonable to even think about that or plan that. But it's not unreasonable to use machine translation at some point. And at that point, I think it is totally feasible for, languages that don't have access to English, but maybe to another major language, or not even a major language, maybe a smaller language, to access content on tips and be able to use it in their work, for sure.
Great. What are your hopes for Bible translation in the future?
I hope that we, as a Bible translation community, find really good ways to to use technology which complements our skills rather than supersedes our skills. I think that we are in a really interesting period right now because machine translation has arrived in many aspects of Bible translation, but I'm worried sometimes that we're moving a little bit too fast, and that the beautiful things that we mentioned that you can find in tips are not because of machine translation, and in fact wouldn't be because of machine translation, because machine translation is not going to find those those jewels in languages that can make the biblical text so meaningful to its users. So I hope that we use technology to the highest possible degree, as long as it keeps our skills intact and complements them rather than negates them or supersedes them. Okay. That's my hope.
Fantastic. Jost, thank you very much for being in Fundiendo con la Biblia. We hope to have you in the future again, so we can explain maybe a specific feature of tips. And señoras y señores, gracias por escucharnos el día de hoy. Nos vemos en otro episodio de Fundiendo con la Biblia. Hasta la próxima.